September 2, 1945. Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. The summer heat pressed down on the ruined dockyard like a physical weight. Concrete rubble still smoldered in places where incendiary bombs had struck weeks earlier. The smell, charred wood, salt air, human waste, and something else, something indefinable that spoke of collapse and ending, hung thick in the morning air. Along the twisted remains of what had once been a perimeter fence, several dozen Japanese civilians stood in a ragged line, silent, watching as the first American occupation troops disembarked from landing craft. They were mostly women, a few elderly men, some children with hollowed cheeks and eyes that seemed too large for their faces. Their clothing was patched, repatched, fabric worn thin by years of wartime scarcity. Many stood barefoot on the hot pavement. They waited with the peculiar stillness of people who have learned that stillness is the only response left when everything familiar has been destroyed. They waited because rumors had spread through the shattered neighborhoods of Yokosuka that the Americans were distributing something, though no one was certain what, and everyone feared what might be demanded in return. The Marines who came ashore that morning carried rifles, certainly, but also burlap sacks stenciled with English words the civilians could not read. Rice, U.S. Army, and soap for distribution. Within an hour, young American soldiers, most barely 20 years old, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, were handing out 5-pound bags of white rice and bars of wrapped soap to people who had, weeks earlier, been told that these same soldiers were demons who would commit unspeakable atrocities. A grandmother accepted a bag of rice with both hands, bowing reflexively, and then stood staring at it as if it might vanish. A young mother clutched soap to her chest, tears tracking through to understand the profound psychological shock of that September morning, and the thousands of similar scenes that unfolded across Japan in the autumn of 1945. One must first comprehend what Japanese civilians had been told, repeatedly and with absolute conviction, about the nature of their enemy. For 4 years, the Japanese government had conducted a propaganda campaign of remarkable intensity and consistency. Americans were depicted as barbaric, subhuman, motivated by racial hatred and territorial greed. Posters showed caricatured American soldiers with demonic features. Radio broadcasts warned that American occupation would mean mass execution, systematic rape, starvation, and cultural annihilation. These were not mere exaggerations. They were the official narrative, reinforced daily through every channel of communication the state controlled. Schoolchildren were taught that surrender meant death worse than combat. Civilian defense manuals instructed families to commit collective suicide rather than face capture. In the final months before surrender, military authorities distributed sharpened bamboo spears to civilians with instructions to fight to the death when the invasion came. The conditioning was so complete that when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, his radio address sparked a wave of suicides among military officers and civilians who could not conceive of submitting to the atrocities they believed inevitable. Families in rural areas killed their children and themselves. Women in cities cut their hair and darkened their faces with ash, hoping to appear less attractive to the rapists they expected. Entire communities in Okinawa and other southern islands had already demonstrated what this propaganda produced. Mass civilian deaths, often by their own hands, driven by terror of American occupation. Against this backdrop of fear, genuine, visceral, culturally reinforced fear, the American troops arrived carrying rice and soap. The rice was symbolic in ways that transcended its immediate nutritional value. Rice was not merely food in Japanese culture. It was the foundation of existence, the measure of wealth, the substance around which social organization and ritual practice revolved. The Japanese word for meal and cooked rice were identical. To have rice, and by September 1945, Japan was starving. The final year of the war had seen the complete breakdown of the nation's food distribution system. American submarines had strangled maritime commerce, cutting off imports from Korea and Southeast Asia that had sustained the home islands. Strategic bombing had destroyed rail networks and food processing facilities. The 1945 rice harvest was projected to be the worst in decades, and even that diminished yield could not be efficiently distributed. Urban areas were hit hardest: Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, cities swollen with refugees from bombed-out regions, places where every calorie was rationed and the official ration itself was insufficient for survival. Black markets flourished, but at prices only the wealthy could afford. Ordinary families sent children to the countryside to beg for food from rural relatives. Women traded kimonos, family heirlooms, sometimes centuries old, for handfuls of barley. Newspapers carried daily reports of deaths from malnutrition, though the actual numbers were suppressed to maintain morale. By August 1945, the average Japanese urban civilian was consuming roughly 1,400 calories per day, barely enough to sustain basic metabolic function, certainly not enough for manual labor or childhood growth. The government's own internal projections, declassified after the war, estimated that without immediate food imports, Japan would experience mass famine by winter 1945-46, with deaths potentially numbering in the millions. This was not speculative. This was mathematical certainty, acknowledged by Japanese officials even as they publicly maintained that the nation would endure any hardship rather than surrender. Into this context of desperate hunger came American soldiers distributing rice, not as payment, not in exchange for labor or compliance, simply distributing it, 5-pound bags handed out to anyone who lined up, more available when those ran out, surplus from an agricultural system so productive that the occupying force could afford to feed the enemy population as a matter of routine logistics. /**/. Mrs. Fumiko Hayashi was 32 years old on the day she received her first ration from American troops. She had lost her husband at Guadalcanal in 1942, her eldest son in the Philippines in 1944. She lived with her mother-in-law and 2 young daughters in a partially destroyed house in Kawasaki, an industrial suburb of Tokyo that had been hit hard by firebombing raids. Acorns ground into bitter flour, occasionally a bit of fish when Fumiko could trade work for food at the docks. She described, in an oral history recorded in 1982, her experience at the American distribution point in early September. "I went because I had no choice," she said. "My daughters were so thin I could count their ribs. My mother-in-law was too weak to walk. I don't know what I expected. Violence, perhaps. Humiliation, certainly. We had been told the Americans would use food to force us into shameful acts, that starvation was preferable to the degradation of accepting enemy charity. But when I reached the front of the line, a young soldier, he looked perhaps 19, with red hair and freckles, simply handed me a bag of rice. He smiled. He said something in English I couldn't understand. Another soldier, one with a Japanese phrase book, said in broken Japanese, "For you, for your family, no payment." I stood there holding this rice, this impossibly white rice, more rice than I had seen in a year, and he just waved me on, motioning for the next person. No demands, no conditions. I carried it home and I didn't speak the entire way. I couldn't, because everything I had been told was a lie. If they were demons, why were they feeding us? If they hated us, why were they saving our children? That bag of rice, it wasn't just food. It was proof that everything I had believed about the war, about the enemy, about why we were fighting was false. /**/. The soap carried its own weight of symbolism, perhaps less obvious but equally profound. In the hierarchy of wartime scarcity, soap had disappeared even earlier than adequate food. Oil and fats required for soap production had been redirected to military use, lubricants, explosives, rations. leaving civilian production at near zero by 1944. Stores sold ersatz soap, if they sold anything at all, made from clay and ash, bars that dissolved quickly and cleaned poorly. Most families simply went without. The absence of soap meant more than uncleanliness, though conditions in Japan's bombed cities were certainly filthy by any standard. It meant disease. Lice infestations were endemic. Skin infections spread unchecked. Dysentery and while simultaneously failing to provide the basic materials that made cleanliness possible. It was one more bitter contradiction in a final year full of them. And then American soldiers distributed soap, real soap, factory-made, wrapped in paper, soap that lathered and cleaned, soap provided in such abundance that soldiers sometimes gave away their personal supplies when official distributions ran short. The contrast was almost obscene. Japan's industrial system had collapsed to the point that basic hygiene products were unavailable, while the American military treated soap as so commonplace that it could be given away by the ton. One woman, interviewed by American military government researchers in late 1945, described washing her children with American soap for the first time. They had had lice for over a year, she said. I had tried everything, cutting their hair short, boiling their clothes when we had fuel for boiling, picking through their hair every night. Nothing worked. Then we received this soap from the Americans, and within a week, the lice were gone. Such a simple thing. Soap. But it represented something I could barely comprehend, that the people we were told were our mortal enemies cared more about my children's hygiene than our own government had in the final years of the war. \\\. The cognitive dissonance this created was not merely individual. It was cultural, collective, a nationwide experience of reality contradicting ideology so profoundly that the psychological structure supporting 4 years of total war simply collapsed. Japanese civilians had endured enormous hardship because they believed it was necessary, because the state had convinced them that the alternative was extinction. The sacrifice meant something when framed as national survival. But what did it mean when the enemy you had been taught to fear, as genocidal monsters arrived offering food and medicine? American military planners had, in fact, engaged in extensive pre-surrender planning about how to handle the occupation of Japan. The lessons of post-World War I Germany loomed large. Punitive occupation had created conditions for extremism and eventual renewed conflict. The American approach to Japan was designed, from the outset, to be transformative rather than punitive. Food aid was central to this strategy, both for humanitarian reasons and pragmatic. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers and given authority over the occupation, understood the symbolic importance of feeding Japan. In September 1945, he cabled Washington requesting immediate food shipments, warning that mass starvation was imminent and that preventing it was essential to successful occupation. The response was swift. The U.S. government authorized immediate diversion of food supplies, ultimately shipping over 800,000 tons of food to Japan between September 1945 and June 1946. Rice from California, wheat from Kansas, powdered milk from Wisconsin, American agricultural abundance poured into Japanese ports, distributed through occupation authorities and relief organizations. The scale was stunning. In 1946, American food aid to Japan exceeded the total food imports Japan had received from all sources in 1935, a peacetime year when the nation's economy was functioning normally. The occupying force was literally feeding the defeated population at levels superior to what Japan's own government had managed during peacetime prosperity. The ideological implications were inescapable. Japanese wartime propaganda had portrayed the conflict as a civilizational struggle, Japanese spiritual purity and martial virtue against American materialism and decadence. The Americans, the propaganda claimed, were weak because they were comfortable, corrupted by luxury, incapable of the sacrifice that defined Japanese national character. This narrative had provided meaning to the hardships Japanese civilians endured. Their suffering proved their superiority. Their willingness to sacrifice demonstrated cultural strength that soft, indulgent Americans could never match. The rice and soap destroyed that narrative completely. Here was American abundance made tangible, not weakness but overwhelming strength. Industrial capacity so vast that the Americans could simultaneously wage global war and maintain living standards that left enough surplus to feed their defeated enemies. The material comfort Japanese propaganda had mocked as decadence was revealed as the fruit of an economic system that simply produced more food, more goods, more of everything, than Japan's system could match. Mr. Takeshi Yamamoto, a former Imperial Army officer who survived the war and returned to his home in Nagano Prefecture, described his experience visiting a relative in occupied Yokohama in October 1945. "I saw American soldiers eating lunch," he said in a 1978 interview. "They were casual about it, sitting on the hoods of their vehicles, talking and joking. And the food, sandwiches with meat, fruit, candy, bottles of Coca-Cola. One soldier threw away half a sandwich because he was full, threw it away. I had not seen anyone throw away food in 4 years. I had been an officer. I had led men in combat. I had believed we were fighting for something noble, that our sacrifice would be vindicated by victory or at least meaningful in defeat. But watching that soldier discard food, more food than my family had eaten in a week, I understood that we had lost more than a war. We had lost because we existed in a material reality that could not compete. The Americans didn't defeat us through superior virtue or warrior spirit. They defeated us with sandwiches and soap and the casual abundance of a system we couldn't match. It was humiliating, and yet they were feeding my countrymen with that same abundance. What does one do with such a contradiction?" ****. Children experience the cognitive shift most acutely, lacking adults' ideological investment in the previous narrative. They had been taught to hate and fear Americans through school curricula that portrayed U.S. soldiers as inhuman beasts. Many children had never seen a foreigner before September 1945. Their first encounters with American troops, these tall men with strange accents who handed out chocolate and chewing gum, who made funny faces and showed photographs of their own children, who seemed more interested in playing catch with Japanese kids than in perpetrating the atrocities that propaganda had promised, produced a generation-defining recalibration of worldview. One girl, 9 years old in 1945, recalled decades later the day she first accepted chocolate from an American soldier. "I was terrified," she said. "My mother had told me that the Americans would kill children or worse. But I was hungry, so hungry that even fear couldn't compete with it. This soldier saw me watching from behind a broken wall, and he walked over slowly, smiling, and held out a brown bar wrapped in paper. He unwrapped a corner to show me what it was. I took it and ran, certain he would chase me, certain this was some kind of trap. I didn't eat it immediately. I brought it home and showed my mother, and we both looked at it like it might be poisoned. But eventually hunger won. I took a small bite. It was the most wonderful thing I had ever tasted, sweet, rich, like nothing that existed in Japan anymore, maybe like nothing that had ever existed in Japan. And I realized, if they wanted to kill us, why give us something so precious? It was the chocolate that broke through the propaganda. Monsters don't give you chocolate." This pattern repeated across Japan. Small acts of kindness and casual generosity that contradicted years of indoctrination. Soldiers sharing rations with homeless children. Medics treating Japanese civilians for diseases and injuries. Engineers repairing water systems and power grids in occupied cities. Each interaction was a data point that challenged the ideological framework that had sustained Japanese wartime nationalism. ****. The Japanese government itself was forced to confront this contradiction. In the weeks following surrender, officials scrambled to manage a population that was simultaneously terrified of occupation and desperate for food. Early directives instructed civilians to maintain dignity and avoid shameful dependence on enemy charity. But these directives were issued by a government that could not feed its own people, addressing citizens who were starving. The moral authority required to tell people not to accept food from Americans evaporated when government ration systems remained dysfunctional, while American supplies flowed abundantly. By October 1945, Japanese officials were actively cooperating with American food distribution efforts, not merely permitting them but facilitating them, because the alternative was famine and the civil unrest that famine produces. This cooperation represented a tacit admission that the state which had demanded total sacrifice could not, in the end, provide even basic sustenance, while the enemy it had demonized could and would. Documents from the Japanese Welfare Ministry, declassified in the 1970s, reveal internal discussions that are remarkable for their frank acknowledgement of the situation. A memo dated October 12, 1945, notes, "American food aid has prevented the mass starvation that would otherwise have occurred this autumn. The population's reception of this aid creates significant ideological complications for future governance, as it demonstrates American capacity for generosity that contradicts the narrative we promoted during wartime. However, accepting this aid is not optional. The mathematical reality of our food deficit makes American imports the only barrier between current conditions and nationwide famine. We must accept this dependence and manage its psychological implications as best we can." That phrase, "manage its psychological implications," speaks to the profound challenge the Japanese government faced. How do you maintain any semblance of national pride when your people are kept alive by the generosity of the enemy you recently taught them to hate? How do you construct a post-war national identity when the foundational narrative of wartime sacrifice has been revealed as based on false premises about both enemy intentions and relative national capacity? *****. The soap, the recurring symbol of that autumn, appeared in Japanese consciousness as something more than hygiene product. It became shorthand for the entire experience of occupation, a tangible representation of the gap between what had been promised and what was being lived. In letters, in diaries, in conversations captured by American intelligence officers conducting surveys, Japanese civilians returned again and again to the image of American soap. Its availability, its quality, its casual abundance. One woman's diary, preserved in a historical archive in Tokyo, includes an entry from November 1945. "Today we received soap again. Real soap, not the ash mixture we have used for 2 years. My daughter asked me why the Americans have so much soap when we have none. I could not answer her. How do I explain that we fought a war against a nation that produces so much of everything that they can afford to give it away? How do I explain that our government told us we were superior while we went without basic necessities? And now, the people we called inferior are providing those necessities without asking anything in return. The soap sits on my shelf, wrapped in its paper, and every time I see it, these questions return. It is just soap, but it represents something I cannot fully articulate, a shift in understanding, a recognition that everything we believed was incorrect. The soap was democratic in its distribution. It went to everyone, regardless of status or prior allegiance. Former military officers received the same rations as civilians. Families of war criminals received the same aid as families of victims. The Americans did not distinguish, did not punish through selective deprivation, did not use food as a weapon to reward compliance or extract concessions. This universality itself was shocking to a population accustomed to hierarchical distribution systems, where access to scarce resources depended on social status, political connections, and demonstrated loyalty to the state. In Japanese culture, gifts created obligations. The complex social practice of jiiri, reciprocal obligation, meant that receiving something imposed a duty to return value. But how did one reciprocate a gift given by a military occupier who demanded no payment, no loyalty oath, no acknowledgement beyond simple receipt? The Americans were distributing aid according to their own logic, one that treated food and soap as basic entitlements rather than privileges to be earned or rewards to be granted. This cultural dissonance created its own form of shock. A nation structured around hierarchical relationships and reciprocal obligations was confronted with an occupier who provided material support without establishing the expected web of debt and duty. It was, in its way, a revolutionary act, not because it was intended as such, but because it operated according to principles that were fundamentally foreign to Japanese social organization. *****. By early 1946, the pattern was well established. American food aid continued to flow, supplemented by medical supplies, clothing, and the gradual restoration of basic services. The occupation, while certainly imposing and in many ways authoritarian, MacArthur ruled with sweeping powers, and Japanese sovereignty was effectively suspended, did not manifest the horrors that propaganda had promised. There were incidents, certainly, crimes committed by individual soldiers, abuses of power, the inevitable friction of military occupation. But the systematic atrocities, the mass executions, the campaign of racial extermination that Japanese civilians had been told to expect never materialized. Instead, there was rice, there was soap, there were chocolate bars and medical treatment and engineers rebuilding infrastructure. There was a massive program of agricultural reform that redistributed land to tenant farmers, a project of women's suffrage that granted voting rights Japanese feminists had sought for decades, a constitution that enshrined civil liberties the Meiji system had never recognized. The occupation was transformative, sometimes heavy-handed, often paternalistic, but it was not annihilationist. It sought to remake Japan, not destroy it. The contrast between expectation and reality produced a psychological shift that historians still debate. Some argue it created a kind of cultural Stockholm syndrome, a dependence that shaped post-war Japanese attitudes toward America in complicated ways. Others contend it represented genuine transformation, a population recognizing that their wartime government had lied to them and embracing a different set of social and political values. Likely it was both and neither, complex, contradictory, varying across, but the rice and the soap were real. The hunger that was prevented was real. The diseases that were treated were real. And the memory of that first autumn, when the enemy arrived carrying food instead of weapons, when the demons revealed themselves as young men who missed their own homes and showed pictures of their families, that memory became foundational to how post-war Japan understood both its defeat and its reconstruction. *****. An elderly man, interviewed in 1989 about his experiences in 1945, offered a reflection that captures something essential about that period. He had been a schoolteacher before the war, drafted into service in 1943, wounded in Okinawa, evacuated to the home islands just before surrender. He returned to his destroyed neighborhood in Osaka in September 1945, expecting to find his family dead or scattered. Instead, he found them alive, thin but surviving, maintained by American rations. "I had taught my students that we were fighting for our civilization," he said. "I had taught them that the Americans represented everything corrupt and degenerate about the modern world, that we must resist them to preserve our culture, our values, our way of life. I believed this. I went to war believing this, and when I returned my mother showed me a bag of rice, American rice, and said, 'This is what has kept us alive, not the emperor, not the army, not the promises of government. This rice from the people you told me were our enemies. What do you say to that? How do you reconcile belief with reality when reality is a 5-pound bag of rice that stands between your family and starvation? I had no answer. I still have no answer. But I know that the rice was real and the hunger it prevented was real, and the propaganda that told me Americans were demons was a lie. Everything else, politics, ideology, national pride, all of it is complicated. But the rice was simple. It was food given when we needed food. It was humanity shown when we expected destruction. If that is what America represented, then everything I had taught was wrong. \\\. In the years that followed, Japan rebuilt with American aid. Financial support through programs like GARIOA and EROA, technical assistance, and guaranteed markets for Japanese exports. The relationship was not equal. Japan was dependent, constrained, occupied until 1952 and aligned with American interests long after. But it was also transformative, producing by the 1970s an economic miracle that saw Japan become the world's second-largest economy. The memory of that first autumn, when occupation began with food aid rather than violence, became part of the founding mythology of post-war Japan. It was complicated, fraught with unresolved questions about collaboration and cultural change and loss of sovereignty. But it was also, for many who lived through it, a moment of profound relief. Relief that the worst had not happened, that survival was possible, that the future might be different from what they had feared. The soap, bars of wrapped soap distributed in September 1945 to a population that had gone without, became in memory a symbol of that moment. It was prosaic and profound simultaneously, ordinary and extraordinary. It represented cleanliness, health, dignity. But it also represented the gulf between propaganda and reality, between what the Japanese government had promised and what the American occupation delivered, between the expectation of annihilation and the experience of reconstruction. Years later, a woman who had been a child in Hiroshima during the occupation, who had survived the atomic bombing and the chaotic months that followed, described finding a bar of American soap while sorting through her mother's belongings after her death. It was unused, still wrapped, kept for decades as a memento of that autumn. "I asked my mother once why she kept it," the woman said. "She told me it was to remember being hungry and being fed, to remember being told that enemies were monsters and learning they were men, to remember that the world was not what we had been told it was, and that sometimes reality is better than what we feared, even when it comes in the form of occupation and defeat." The soap was just soap, but it was also memory, tangible and preserved, of a moment when everything changed. \\\. There is a broader truth in this story, one that extends beyond Japan's specific experience of defeat and occupation. Wars create narratives, stories nations tell themselves about why they fight, who they fight, what victory or defeat will mean. These narratives are necessary for sustaining conflict, for justifying sacrifice, for maintaining cohesion under stress. But they are also, inevitably, simplifications, reductions of complex reality into forms that can be communicated and believed. The Japanese narrative of 1941-1945 was particularly rigid, particularly totalizing. It had to be, to sustain a war that demanded so much sacrifice. But rigidity meant fragility. When reality contradicted the narrative, when the enemy behaved differently than predicted, when occupation brought food instead of annihilation, the entire ideological structure collapsed with startling speed. The rice and soap were agents of that collapse, not because they were intended as ideological weapons. American food aid was primarily pragmatic, designed to prevent famine and create stable conditions for occupation. But they became weapons nonetheless, dissolving years of propaganda through the simple, undeniable fact of their existence. You cannot maintain that your enemy is inhuman when that enemy is handing you food. You cannot sustain belief in your own superiority when you depend on your conqueror's abundance for survival. The transformation this produced was not immediate, not universal, not without resistance and complication. But it was real. Post-war Japan was not simply defeated militarily. It was transformed ideologically, its understanding of itself and the world fundamentally altered by the experience of occupation. And that transformation began in September 1945, with bags of rice and bars of soap distributed to a population that expected genocide and instead received sustenance. In the end, the most powerful weapons are not always the most violent. Sometimes they are the most human, the ones that meet basic needs, that demonstrate care, that reveal the enemy as something other than monstrous. The B-29s that had devastated Japan's cities were fearsome machines of war. But the bags of rice carried ashore by young Marines in September 1945 accomplished something no amount of bombing could achieve. They changed minds, altered beliefs, opened possibility where propaganda had foreclosed it. The soap sits in memory, wrapped, preserved, symbolic, just soap, but also everything. Evidence of abundance, proof of generosity, artifact of a moment when the expected horror failed to materialize and something different, something unexpected, took its place. The grandmother receiving that first bar, bowing in reflexive gratitude, tears tracking through grime on her face. She was experiencing not just relief but revelation. The world was not what she had been told. The enemy was not who she had feared. And in the space between expectation and reality, between propaganda and lived experience, a new understanding became possible. That understanding, born of hunger satisfied and fear unrealized, would shape a generation and a nation. It would complicate memory, inform identity, structure the relationship between former enemies. It was not simple. It was not uncomplicated. But it began with rice and soap, distributed on a September morning to a people who expected destruction and received, instead, evidence of a different possibility. The contrails had faded from the sky. The war had ended. And in the ruins of defeat,